In this episode, we address the hype cycle of AI. With over $1 trillion being spent so far, why is it taking so long for AI to automate everything in our lives? I mean, seriously, shouldn't we all have a robot by now?
Welcome to the show, where AI takes the floor. Lee and Rich on the mic.
Welcome to the AI Guys podcast, where we make artificial intelligence easy to understand for everyone. I'm your host, Lee Dixon, and as always, I'm joined by our in-house CrowdStrike sympathizer, Rich Schweier. How's it going, man?
Doing good, man. Good
Back
to be
in
home.
the States? Yeah, exactly. It's
That
been a
intro
while.
sounded like you like smooth jazz. It was you had a little bit of a different tone, a little bit of a sensual, like
Yeah, I mean, I've
after 10 p.m. type tone. I like it.
time changes all of us, Rich. You know, and I'm glad to be back in your presence here in the building. But today, actually, we're gonna be diving into a little bit of a broader topic than usual. I think the recent AI hype and how some of the space are trying to slow the roll of businesses looking to adopt AI solutions is something we should address. So I was hoping we could jump right into that.
Yeah, I think today we wanted to talk more about, AI and the conversation around it has been, about a year and a half. And obviously, the high level summary for those who haven't been, who don't live it and breathe it like we do, that actually have regular, normal lives and enjoy their weekends with their families. If you were to kind of highlight the last 2 years, really what it comes down to is, almost $1 trillion has gone into, building out the infrastructure of AI, primarily into the chips, that NVIDIA and others are manufacturing. And most of the what we call hyperscalers, like the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples, the Microsofts of the world, are responsible for putting the hundreds of billions of dollars into those chips. And so really, obviously, when you put a lot of money into something like that, you're looking to get money out. And This is not too dissimilar to what happened in the early or late 90s, I guess, with infrastructure around telecom. When the internet started to show promise, much like how AI shows promise today, you had the telecom race where companies like Comcast, AT&T spent billions of dollars building out the infrastructure for that, both on mobile as well as broadband. And again, same kind of conversation was happening 2 years into it. Oh, wow, these companies are spending billions of dollars. It could be all of this hype around the internet. It's not going to pay out. How are they going to ever make money, from all of this investment they're making? And so we're seeing the same kind of conversation happen today, although at a much different scale, because, there were no multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies like the Googles and Microsofts at the
Back
level
then
that we
at
see
all.
today. Yeah, pretty much only Microsoft, really. And so when you have like 5 or 6 companies looking to win the race of AI, you have a overspending of infrastructure. So that's obviously going to lead to what the topic today, which is this hyped? How on earth are they going to turn this money into profits, and at what time frame? That's the other component. How long is it going to take? And so that's the question on, I think, everybody's mind, specifically the market. When you're looking at these companies and how they're going to perform, from a stock and revenue perspective, but even internally, like for us, for anybody in this AI ecosystem, whether you're building products or you're about to deploy a product, it's probably also a healthy conversation to understand when this market matures. So I think that's what we're going to try to cover today.
Yeah, I think, with a lot of ways that AI has moved in the last 12 to 18 months specifically. I mean, I really think you got to draw a line between consumer AI experience and business AI experience. A lot of the negative kind of articles, or I think spin that's kind of going on out there, is almost like someone who's in a magic trick, and like they look at their card, they stick it in the deck, and the guy takes it and he's like, "Is it the 3 of clubs?" And he's like, "Nope." And he's just like getting off on the fact that this person doesn't know it until he goes, "All right, now check your suit pocket." And he's like, "Holy shit, like it's here." So like they're kind of almost in this anti-hype cycle, a lot of these people, because I think they feel that they can grab some of the people that are in between and saying like, well, let me get those views. Let me pull over that audience here, because as soon as things catch on anyways, at least I've gained some clout or traction, maybe from, I'm not saying that like ZNet and all of them need that kind of stuff. But there's definitely, whenever there's a positive swing in new tech development, there's always going to be the negative counterpart trying to figure out ways to, kind of poke holes in something that really with AI hasn't been fully fleshed out yet anyways.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at this as a pure kind of analyst perspective and looking at trying to calculate ROI, I think you're dead on. You have to separate consumer from business. And so let's start with the consumer element of this.
Yeah.
When Facebook basically said, we're going to open source our model and we don't mind spending hundreds of billions of dollars on AI without any sight of revenue directly from that AI investment, we're just going to assume that we're going to somehow supplement this revenue with additional, more better ads or better ad revenue, whatever it might be. So they basically, with, in at least in the context of what today's use case is, which is kind of like the ChatGPT experience that consumers have, they essentially took a lot of the revenue out of the projections for all these other companies, because they're forcing everybody to come to the table with a very cheap alternate, so that not everybody runs for the hills and uses Facebook. So like we've seen that even in the last few weeks, where ChatGPT or OpenAI has started building smaller and cheaper models so that they didn't have this massive movement from users of OpenAI to Facebook or to open source models. And so this closed source, open source type fight in the consumer realm is not looking very optimistic as far as big revenue, albeit OpenAI being the fastest growing company with the fastest growing app in the history of the internet is reporting some serious numbers, and they're talking about going public, but they're talking about approaching multi tens of billions of dollars in revenue just off their ChatGPT product. So there is evidence that consumers are willing to spend 10, 20, 30 bucks a month for what ChatGPT delivers. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So you have this interesting dynamic on the consumer side. But I think where most of the conversation is being had is on the business side, which is where we live. And how does a company project the potential savings and or additional revenue from leveraging AI in their infrastructure, in their ecosystem? And so this is where I think it really gets more interesting, because unlike consumer products, which are relatively easy to deploy, right? It almost shows up magically on your phone or magically on a web browser, and it's relatively easy to use. When you're talking about implementing AI into the business, it's a much more challenging process to go through. And I think that's where we are today. I think where we are today is almost every single business that I can imagine that exists that's reasonable size. I wouldn't say every small business. I don't think plumbers are racing around trying to figure out how OpenAI can change the way that they fix pipes. But I think for most businesses, especially knowledge workers, businesses that require technology or have some sort of internal systems that where they see an opportunity to save money or make money, are in the testing phase or trial phase of something that resembles AI. But I think everybody's at kind of a standstill, I think, for three reasons. One, I don't think there's a lot of training and testing or capability of testing what AI can do within a business. I think we're very immature in that world. And that's classic early stage ecosystem, because the infrastructure hasn't been built out. We're very early, right?
There's not enough examples for people to call back to. Yeah.
And there's just lack of understanding, just like the internet, days of the internet, where people didn't understand how websites would work. Like, okay, I want to develop a website or launch a website, but how do I transact through a website, right? It wasn't that easy it was as it is today back, 30 years ago. Yeah. So we're in that same kind of cycle, although I think it'll accelerate once all the ecosystem providers and the hyperscalers upgrade and build out those apps that make it easier for the smaller business to adopt. Number two is, I just don't think there's that many people who even understand how it works beyond the simple prompting and the simple user experience of ChatGPT. There's a very small number of people, specifically technology people, that have really kind of spent the time and energy to learn it and understand it, because it's so much different than what we typically would do, right? It's not technology. It's a completely different you know, piece of the ecosystem that is brand new. You know, this idea of LLM, this idea of prompting and prompt engineering
Yeah.
didn't exist 6 months ago. So obviously there's going to be a very small number of people, and those people are in high demand. So
Yeah.
you're
It's
going to
not
either
just
have to,
zeros and ones that you're coding on the back end
yeah,
that somebody has seen before. I mean, there is a decent amount of trial and error when it comes to refining a model for your use case, if the business even really understands what their use case is. And I think that's another thing that we've ran into
yeah, I
recently.
absolutely. I think AI as a general, call it, you know, um, role in a company, right? You're the head of AI, or you're the CAIO, or you're the guy who everybody's thrown at you and said, "Hey, figure this AI out stuff and come back to us with a plan." I think that role or that person, number one, is kind of left to their own. You know, they have to go out and find some way of learning this stuff, which is very complicated and difficult. In fact, I would say that AI and that AI role is the most complicated role that somebody could, you know, is being faced to evolve in, but yet it's the simplest role. It's so weird. It's kind of this like idea of like, oh, here's ChatGPT. You could easily just talk to ChatGPT and give it a prompt, which is extremely simple. It's very simple user interface. It's probably the most simple user interface that has existed in some time. But how it operates and the black box that you're kind of controlling makes it even more complex, right? And we've even published quite a few blogs around all the different approaches that you can take with prompting and how complicated it can be in order to get the results you need.
Yeah.
And so it's the combination of all these things that is slowing down, it is creating inertia when deploying AI, especially in a production environment. And obviously we live it because we have we built out a platform, a launch platform that helps companies accelerate and do this, and kind of with a lot more ease than if they had to do it on their own. And we provide testing and training tools that give them the comfort to kind of accelerate a lot of the projects that they might be worried about launching prior to seeing it actually how it works. But because platforms like us, which we've only been around for a year or so, are so new and they're undiscovered yet, I think as people start to understand that there's tools out there and there's ways of kind of accelerating through this inertia, I think next year will be the year where everybody starts deploying, maybe not in a big way, but in a small way, very succinct and applications that are AI driven inside of their ecosystems that are going to have real benefit. But that is only going to take years before we start seeing ROI. So,
Yeah.
to answer the big question, which we're asking on this episode is this a hype cycle? Are we in a hype cycle? And I think what we're really witnessing here is an adoption cycle, right? And it's a slow
that's a
to
good way to
adopt.
put it.
Yeah, we're adopting much slower than what I think people would like, obviously. I mean, obviously Google, Microsoft, OpenAI all want to see businesses adopt it at the same rapid pace that consumers adopted it. But I don't think businesses operate the same way consumers do. If you were to kind of look at it from a realistic perspective, consumers adopted OpenAI through ChatGPT so fast, I don't think anybody would have ever thought that in a million years. And so it's a phenomenon. And to place that same kind of burden on businesses is probably not realistic. Not because AI doesn't deliver the promise, it's because businesses just don't operate that way. They have so much more infrastructure. It's so much more difficult. It's not like you don't alt tab and switch from searching on Google to searching on ChatGPT and everything works. Businesses are much more complicated, much more convoluted.
Well, it's important to point out too, I think maybe one of your best takes on this is that, we are in this adoption cycle right now, right? Like I think the big businesses have pushed the hype level to new heights because they saw how quickly consumers were just eating up ChatGPT, and they thought, well, those consumers, portions of them will own businesses. And so like, guys, consumers love it. Why aren't you loving it yet? I do believe that might be where that tipping point came back from, is that a lot of businesses are still maybe old school in the way that they're kind of treating this, of just like, well, I'm not about to start, throwing money out to an unproven tool, even though I might use it on my daily as a consumer because it doesn't affect me, in my pocket like it does to the business. So yeah, the adoption process, I think, is just not catching up to the hype as quickly. And it's creating that gap that a lot of this article and language that has been coming out is just trying to, capitalize on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think even if you wanted to really dumb it down even more so,
Yeah.
I think almost every single, I would argue that almost somebody in every single business that exists that's, again, relatively advanced from a tech perspective, I would say 80-90% of businesses, somebody within that business is using ChatGPT.
Yeah,
right?
100%.
So we're sitting right here where people are using ChatGPT. And I think the gap that they're trying to cross, the chasm that they're just not seeing and understanding, is ChatGPT is really it's basically a simple example of how powerful OpenAI's LLM is.
Yeah.
ChatGPT is one singular interface, right? And of course, they're getting to multimodal where they're going to have voice, and suddenly it'll start appearing on the iPhone because they did a deal with Apple and so forth. And that's all going to happen this winter. So basically, we have hundreds of millions of people who are using ChatGPT. Now the question is, how do we go from that to using OpenAI, the same basic engine that ChatGPT uses, inside of my business? And how do I make that transition? How do I have my CRM system talk to OpenAI? How do I have my employees talk to OpenAI, but have OpenAI trained within my business processes, my business systems?
Right.
Not a singular prompt experience, but a much more complicated experience, still running on that same, the guts of OpenAI, which is exactly, not to self-promote, but is exactly why we built Rhea, right? Rhea
Rich,
essentially.
Tell me more.
Yeah, for a limited time only.
Yeah, exactly. Can you put a price on peace of mind as a business owner? Hi,
no, I'm
Rich
really
Swire
can't.
from Rhea.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, you're dead on though with that kind of stuff. It isn't something that happens overnight, and I do think that a lot of the businesses that we come across, what we've started, kind of again, just getting away from product for a second. One of the biggest things that I think we've brought value to in just doing this podcast and what we kind of go after is really trying to focus on this education and knowledge base that we also then promote to the customers that we're working with. Is like, look, you're not just flipping a switch and this computer program is just going to start doing the X's and O's. Like, you have to give it curated data to curate the experience you're trying to create. And if you don't have an idea for that, then AI is going to seem like this, just this is a waste of my time because you haven't figured out a way to refine how you're going point A to point B.
Yep. And then honestly, that was the third point of my 3-point argument before. And I think the 10 minutes ago? Like 10 months ago, just rewind. But the third reason why we are hitting inertia when it comes to businesses, and this is honestly, I think, the biggest reason, and this is the classic, reason why all technology takes time, is that businesses typically don't have their, their stuff together. Yeah, they just don't have their stuff together. So to your point, which is exactly right, in order for an AI agent, so let's say an average business might have, let's say the most simplest business, the smallest business you can imagine, might have 4 or 5 AI agents. One that handles internal employee training, hiring, something like that. One that handles sales, lead conversion, supporting their sales reps, setting calendars, and maybe once that handles support, incoming support requests, outbound type of support training to customers, et cetera. Let's just say a multitude of AI agents that are required to kind of automate, let's say 40, 50, 60% of your business process. To get to that point, which every business wants to get to, right? They want to lower costs, increase revenue. To get to that point means that you have to have all of those business processes and systems well documented and well designed.
Absolutely dialed in.
Not just in the heads of your employees, not just in the heads of your CEO, CIO, CMO, or whatever it might be, but it actually has to be documented on paper so that you can feed it into the AI agent. I mean, I always go back to that scene, and this is going to date me, but I know that our viewers are definitely probably within my age range.
Sure.
Because otherwise they would have tuned out a long time ago. But is that scene in Weird Science? You know the movie Weird Science?
Yeah.
Where they're basically building this woman of their dreams, and they have, this is obviously in the 80s, which is obviously the peak of all great movies, Weird Science being top 10. They're feeding their scanner all these things like pictures of Einstein, pictures of girls from Cosmopolitan magazine, all this information, that they want to build this perfect woman. And those guys spent, the movie probably compressed it. They probably spent at least a half a day doing that, right?
Yeah.
So picking apart magazines, and I'm being somewhat facetious and somewhat comical, but like my point is the business has to spend as much or if more time to gather all this information and put it, and then once they actually have it, let's say they have it all outlined, then they actually have to format it and present it in a way that actually is in the right way to feed into an AI
consumable
agent. Which is exactly, again, back to self-promotion, is exactly why we built Rhea, was to allow for that transition. Because you can't just take a bunch of PowerPoints that might have been great for corporate presentations and training internally. You can't just take those and upload them. You have to condense them, consolidate them, put them in the right formats so that the AI can actually upload it into their LLM and fine-tune the LLM in order to answer questions more accurately. And then once you do that, you have to get into testing and training to make sure it actually does answer and ask the right questions and doesn't hallucinate. So that entire process is, I think, probably what's holding everything up. Everybody was like, oh, let's get AI in our business. Let's look what ChatGPT can do. I can upload this spreadsheet, or I can tell it to do this and it does it. I can have it write a blog and it does it. But then you're like, okay, great. Now, how do we make that automated? How do we get it off of the ChatGPT experience into my business ecosystem? And they're like, oh, wait, I have to actually do the work and document it and do all this other stuff.
Yeah, because I might also do it slightly different. I think a rule of thumb right now with any business is that if you're looking at automating something and the first thing in your head is, what I like to do is, that's wrong. If it's like, well, Jim does it this way, but I do it this way, then you're not going to be able to automate that, because you're both going to have different views on how this has to go point A to point B. So it has to be something that is, simplified and somewhat, able to replicate in a hands-off process without you jumping in and adjusting.
And there's a bit, and one thing that we get asked all the time when we're talking to potential customers is they've already, let's just take a simple example, content creation. Let's say they started writing training materials using ChatGPT, right? Or they started writing blogs, so that's something not everybody understands. So they go into ChatGPT and say, hey, write a blog about this, this, and this, and then they prompt it, and then ChatGPT spits out a blog. Okay. And then the big question is, okay, well, that's great, but how do I automate that? Like, how do I not have to have
prompt?
Right. And how do I enhance the prompt to make these blog articles even better? Or how do I automate the creation of an image? And then more importantly, how do I automate or integrate into my blog software, my WordPress? So like, you're still going through the manual process of cutting and pasting, uploading, They want to kind of make that entire process more automated. Well, that's beyond the scope of what ChatGPT can do. So now you're talking about building out a system that allows for that, right? So that's really the gap that we need to cross, Yeah. And I think, everybody wants to write about, it's high, all this money being spent on infrastructure, But, if you go back in time and you look at every great transformative technology evolution, it has the same story, and I don't think this is any different, right? To build out the mobile phones that we all carry in our pocket, that we spend and look at probably 4, 5, 6 hours a day, that literally without a mobile phone, people, would run crazy in the streets, not knowing what to do with all their in-between time. It took, 12 to 15 years of building out the CDMA, and then the multitude of different layers of mobile phone networks when we went to cellular, right?
Yep.
And it's the same thing with the broadband, same basic investment, hundreds of billions of dollars into building and putting wires in the ground without having one singular dollar made from those wires until they were in the ground, right?
Yeah.
We had broadband in the ground in 98, but it took 6-7 years before it was so pervasive that YouTube could launch, right? So all these speak to the same basic mindset. It's no different than when we built the road system. People invented the car and they thought it was a joke. I saw a great video about how when the cars were invented, it was really for rich people, and they had all these different rules about you couldn't drive a car without having 3 people inside of the car, a mechanic, a driver, and somebody who would actually walk next to the car with a red flag telling people that a car was coming, right? And this is all all before roads were built and infrastructure was built. And then suddenly people said, oh, now that there's roads, maybe I'll buy a car. And then, of course, as more and more people bought cars, the cars got cheap, and now everybody owns 2. So, that might have took 100 years, but every time that we see a technical evolution, it's almost like it takes
speeds it up
a tenth of the time. And I think
Also,
it's going to take 5 years, for us to
sure.
see businesses really truly deploying AI in a meaningful way. But that's a drop in the bucket for the type of transformation it's going to make for what they can actually do with it. You know?
And a big thing too is improvement doesn't happen overnight,
No.
right? Like, but you do get closer every day. So like
Yeah.
if you can treat that with the patience of one trying to better understand something that is going to be an integral part to most businesses that are out there, and
Right.
taking the steps forward, you're already going to be ahead of probably 90% of your competition.
Yeah, and I think major events will happen, and major developments, once companies and competitors start doing it, it will force everybody to come to the table and accelerate it. A great
True.
example of that I think people take for granted, but I think I witness every day. I'm like, wow, that happened overnight. Is during COVID, I don't know how many American restaurants you went to that you would actually bring the payment to the table, where you would just scan your phone.
Mm-hmm.
That was really non-existent in America. I mean, I don't
That's true.
really, it was very rare to see. Now in Europe, they were a little bit ahead of the time, but I don't ever remember any restaurant that I went to that would bring the scanner to the table and I would scan it.
Yeah,
or
they'd
much
always
less
take the card, walk away, come
yeah,
back.
exactly. And then COVID hit, and suddenly everybody had to suddenly everybody adopted this technology that's been out for 5-10 years.
Yeah.
And suddenly now every restaurant I go to, you pay at the table and you don't even take your card out. And so things like that, events, adoption can happen when there's a little bit of a nudge. And I think what will happen eventually, and probably in the next 2 to 3 years, is competitors will come out with such compelling use cases and experiences that's going to force everybody to dive into this technology and embrace it. And then I honestly think it'll be world changing, much like how cellular phones or the internet or broadband or all these other components that we take for granted today, that they just suddenly appeared.
Yeah.
I think it's the same will happen with AI.
Yeah, I think you're dead on with that. And I know we've got a couple other things that we want to kind of dive into on, these types of recent hype cycles, and how it seems like every day you wake up a new model is out, which we'll have to save for another episode of the podcast. But I mean, it was great having you back in here, man. And for everyone at home listening, thanks again for joining us on this episode. If you haven't already hit the subscribe button to stay in touch, please do so. Also, check out our Substack for more content, which will be linked in the episode to continue the discussion. We appreciate you listening to us being seriously stupid, and hopefully we came off surprisingly smart as well. Take care, everyone.
Have a good one.
Takes the flow, Leah Rich on the mic, ready to explore.